YouTube, what is good? It is your boy Flex. And put your muscles up, because we back with another video. So in today's video, man, I bring to you Lenny Mclean, aka the Guvnor. If you're from UK, you probably know who this is, man. If you're not, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video, because we're going to get right to it, man. Put your headphones on, turn the volume up, get that full experience. Let's get into the video. Let's watch it. Let's go.
Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we look at one of the most ruthless and undisputed fighters to ever exist in the UK criminal underworld. On the surface, Leonard John Mclean made his name in the 60s as nothing but another poor boy growing up in harsh social eco-demographics. Another faceless man in the gritty streets of the East End of London. However, in reality, Mr. Mclean was to be an extremely powerful and well-respected man, with experience in multiple professions throughout his lifetime, which were to give him the necessary experience that would be.
That's a big dude, bro. This dude is pretty big, bro. This dude definitely has no neck too. It's another no neck, big back dude, bro.
Be needed to rise to the top of the violent world that was emerging in the UK criminal underworld. An unlicensed boxer, a bouncer, a bodyguard and businessman and actor, Mr. Mclean was often associated with the elite of the UK criminal underworld, especially with the likes of the Cray twins and Charles Bronson, and most famously Roy Shaw. Lenny Mclean was one of Britain's most infamous gangsters and everybody knew not to mess with him. Mr. Mclean quickly became known worldwide as a very large and extremely dangerous man. Mr. Mclean was well known for continuously doing whatever it took to live up to the infamous title as the Undisputed King of the Cobbles.
The King of the Cobbles.
Lenny Mclean was born on the 9th of April 1949 on his Nan Campion's bed, as his mum Rose and dad Lenny Sr. were living with his grandmother at 61 Gospel in Hoxton in the north of London. Lenny and his family were one of the first to move into Godwin House in Kent Street, Bethnal Green. Lenny had grown up with his brothers and sisters Linda, Barry, Lorraine and Raymond. It was hardly the highest of societies. A bleak landscape of factories, poverty and a strong sense of community, but with limited opportunities for anyone outside of crime. Leonard Mclean Sr. was earning good money as a crook, helping bookmakers selling knockoff gear, and was extremely successful as a con man, doing whatever he could to make a bit of extra money for his family. Mr. Mclean Sr. had been a Royal Marine during the Second World War, but had a major heart operation a year before joining. After he caught a near fatal disease in India which affected one of his arteries to his heart, giving him only 2 years to live. Mr. Mclean Sr. had unfortunately died 2 years to the day of receiving the news when Lenny was still very young. Mr. Mclean Sr. was buried in Stamford Hill in the Albany Park Cemetery.
Bro, I never understood how somebody could calculate your lifespan. You know what I mean? Like, how do you know that? How did they know that 2 years exactly he was gonna die?
When Lenny went with his cousin Tony Mclean to look for his father's grave, he found out that his dad had been buried in a pauper's grave, a grave with no headstone, which was common for working class men with not a lot of money to be buried at the time. His mother Rose, being a very attractive woman and now left alone to raise a family, had tried her best to raise the family alone, but during this time there was not a lot of support for a single mother who had been left alone to raise a family, but she did her best. However, as time went by, one man in particular was helping out a lot, and he'd been starting to make advances toward Rose for quite some time. While eventually Rose gave in and things started to get serious. Rose eventually brought this man home and introduced him as Uncle Jim, and said that Uncle Jim would be helping out now.
Hey, bro.
And look,
The hell is this, bro? That's kind of scary. I ain't gonna lie.
looking after everyone. Although everyone was wary at first, he soon brought everyone gifts and was always playing games, and was to begin with at least a nice new addition to the family. However, things were about to change. Uncle Jimmy's real name was Jim Irwin, and as soon as he and Rose had tied the knot and became married, Jim Irwin became a completely different man. Mr. Mclean and his younger brothers suffered greatly at the hands of their alcoholic stepfather, Mr. Irwin, who did not hesitate once he moved into the family house and put his hands on his stepsons and their mother during his years of drunken violent rages.
Do y'all see the trend when it comes to like the big time criminals, like as far as like their childhood and the way they grew up? Y'all see a trend? Let me know if you see a trend.
Irwin broke Lenny's legs when he was 5 and broke his jaw when he was 6. When he was 7, he broke all of his ribs. He bashed a young Mr. Mclean around right about until he was 12. Mr. Mclean explained in his biography. This was a completely different society to the one we know today, and there was no child line for children who were in trouble to ring. In fact, you had to be quite well off to even have a house phone. Lenny even explains that his mother knew what was happening, but being a single mother with 5 children, this man was paying the rent and putting food on the table. Unfortunately, it was a time where little opinions existed for single parents. Worse still for one in a terrible domestic abuse situation. Mr. Mclean had suffered several broken bones at the hands of Mr. Irwin. However, when Mr. Irwin had now gone a step too far and dared to attack Mr. Mclean's infant brother with a belt, when Mr. Mclean's nan found out, she called her brother Lenny's great uncle, Mr. Jimmy Spinks, who was himself a notorious local gangster, weighing in at 21 stone and standing at 5'9". He was described as an extremely powerful man, and once he had heard what had happened, he was not too impressed to say the least. Mr. Spinks then took it upon himself to find and proceed to beat Mr. Irwin within an inch of his life, threatening to leave his face a mess, or better still, cut his throat should he ever need to come back to the house to protect the children again. And with that beating and realization that his drunken cowardly behaviour would no longer be tolerated within the family home, Mr. Irwin got his stuff and disappeared. Mr. Mclean has explained many times that he took a great amount of inspiration from his great uncle Jimmy throughout his life, and as a result of this inspiration, when Mr. Mclean became a famous street fighter and unlicensed boxer himself some years later, Mr. Mclean stated that every victory he earned on and off the cobbles was on behalf of any child who might be suffering or going through any of the things that he had got to go through in his younger self.
Now that's powerful, you know, that's powerful. But at the same time, there's like there's better ways to fight for those children instead of literally fighting. You know what I mean? Like the intentions is very commendable and it's amazing. You know, but why not start up an organization where if those kids are really in need, they have a place to go, you know, especially since you know that feeling and you've been there in that situation, instead of actually literally fighting for these kids, because at the end of the day, you know, these kids are still going through what they're going through, you know. Start up a different organization, you know. And of course, you know, this is old stuff, so there's nothing can be done about it now, but you know, that's just my thinking on that. That's just my thought process.
Mclean's childhood of constant violence and physical and mental abuse led him to express his own anger and rage in a very unique and uncontrolling way. When Mr. Mclean had lost his temper, he became unstoppable, which would often result in several men having to come together in an attempt to hold him back, gaining Mr. Mclean the nickname 10 Men Len, due to the number of men it usually took to be able to restrain him. Mr. Spinks, Lenny's uncle, had become somewhat of a father figure to Lenny Mclean during the 50s and 60s. Mr. Spinks was the governor of Hoxton and was very well known and respected. He was in one of the gangs that ran the horse racing circuits. Mr. Spinks was giving protection to all the important bookmakers who were operating at the time, especially for the head bookmaker, a Jewish man who went by the name Lasky. Mr. Spinks was a very generous man, but extremely powerful and menacing. Mr. Spinks was always dressed immaculately, and it was commonplace to see him in a white shirt, tie, and a big hat, with a Crombie overcoat and the pinstripe suit, always the finely dressed gangster. In this forgotten era, men tended to fight more often than not to settle disputes. It was around this time that Lenny would have his first fistfight and found out that fighting was something he was very good at. Lenny's first paid fight was when his younger brother had come into the house crying with a fat lip. Once he calmed down, his mother had discovered that it was a bully who had lived below them. A young lad named Brian had been picking on his brother and punched his lip. Lenny's mother looked at him and said, "Go and sort him out, Lenny," and Lenny went down to Brian, who was the same age as Lenny at the time but a much bigger lad, and hit him so hard that he started to cry. Upon arriving back home, Lenny's mum went to her purse and paid him 3 old pennies. This award felt just as good as when he would earn many thousands of pounds for his various fights in the future.
I ain't gonna lie, man. I'm gonna do it for free. If you mess with my brother, you bullying anybody in my family, you ain't gotta pay me to put your lights out. It's on the house.
Mr. Mclean's abilities for fighting were more than evident for anyone who stood in his path early on. Mr. Mclean took on local bullies at the age of only 9, an impressive feat by any means. However, now under the wing of Mr. Spinks, Mr. Mclean was now exposed to even more deeper and darker sides of London's criminal underworld. At the age of 13, Mr. Mclean was in a firm of kind, which consisted of Andy Bradshaw, Joe Kyle and Tommy Green.
This is not a 13-year-old, right? Like, he's not 13 right here, right? Or is this like your average looking 13-year-old in the 70s or 60s or whatever this is? If so, that's kind of scary, bro. I ain't gonna lie. And this would explain why a lot of you guys are like built different, you know?
Firm would jump over the shop walls and steal empty lemonade bottles and collect the 3p deposit that each bottle was worth back in those days. The gang would also take part in jump-ups. This would be where they waited for a lorry to make a delivery to the shop, and once the driver was inside, they would ransack the truck, stealing as much as possible. One night, Lenny was with a kid a few years older than himself, who went by the name of Charlie, and worked for a Jewish firm as a tailor. Charlie always carried a penknife with him, which he used for work, and Lenny, not one to be upstage, has gotten himself a bayonet. As the two were walking around, something about the pair caught the old Bill's eye. The police stopped the pair and conducted a search. Upon searching them, they uncovered both knives, and they arrested both of them, and bailed to appear in Bow Juvenile Court in 30 days. On the day of court, Charlie was up first. He was not in court long, and on his way out passed Lenny with a smile, saying he had just got a result and just a £3 fine. When Lenny went up against the judge, he was sentenced to 3 years in an approved school. Mr. Mclean was then took to Stanford House, where he would be assessed and designated to an approved school to serve his sentence. When Lenny got to Stanford House, he was told by others that people were calling him out and saying that he was afraid. Lenny told the people to send a message back saying that he wasn't afraid of anyone. One afternoon of Friday, when the people who were staying at Stanford House were allowed to play out, Lenny was approached by the leader of the gang who ran the school, and a small scuffle broke out but was interrupted by the teachers. The teacher said, "You know the rules, if you want to fight it's in the ring, meet at the gym at 3 o'clock or both of you are on detention." Mr. Mclean did not know at the
Bro, that's how it should. That's how all school systems should be, bro. That's how all school systems should be. And then, especially here in the United States, you probably have less school shooters. You know what I mean? Just like if you guys got beef, bro, just take it to the gym. You guys box it out. You know what I'm saying? And then after that, you let it go, and you go about your ways.
time, but all fights within the school were settled inside a boxing ring on a Saturday afternoon, where the whole school would be there to watch. Mr. Mclean beat the gang leader in 2 rounds, and both fighters were called to the desk to collect their prize, which was an apple or an orange. The winner got to pick first. The two became close friends, and both went on to run after escaping from the school one day. But after 2 days of walking with no food and no money, they decided to give themselves in. And for this escape, they received a punishment described by Mr. Mclean as 6 of the best, 2 on each hand and 2 on the backside, as well as a loss of privileges. All in all, Mr. Mclean had served 18 months and was released by the age of 15. He had now reached the end of school age, and it was now decided to find a job after Mr. Mclean was fired from his first legitimate job after locking his manager in the toilet as a prank. Mr. Mclean realised that he had to do something else and turned back to the streets, committing petty crime to make a living. Lenny and his cousin Tony had gotten involved in a scam robbery of a shoe shop. Everything went well, but once the word had gotten out about the scam, others tried muscling in and the entire scam was exposed and the police got involved. Mr. Mclean was back in front of the court, this time with his cousin Tony. Accompanying Lenny and Tony were Lenny's mum Rose, Lenny's grandmother who had raised Tony, as well as Lenny's uncle Bobby Warren. Bobby Warren is the dad to the now infamous boxing promoter Frank Warren, which has made Lenny and Frank cousins. Bobby Warren was also known as a quiet man who never took liberties. He was certainly no stranger to prison, and had ended up serving 7 years back in the 50s along with Mad Frankie Frazier for being involved in the murder of Jack Spot. At the time of the murder, Mr. Warren had worked and was a good friend of Albert Dimes, who had controlled most of Soho and its criminal underworld. For the shoe shop scam, Lenny and his cousin Tony received time in Borstal, Wormwood Scrubs, and inside the prison, Lenny was subjected to many fights, not just for himself but to protect his cousin Tony too. Eventually, after proving to be too much for the prison staff, the pair were shipped out to Holsby Bay Borstal on the Suffolk coast. While serving time at Holsby Bay Borstal, Mr. Mclean met and became good friends with David Fraser, the son of Mad Frankie Fraser, and was sat in the association room when it was announced on TV that the Richardson gang had been sentenced, a gang that David's dad was a part of. Upon release from Borstal, Lenny made his way back home and was greeted like he had never left. Most people thought he had just been away on a job earning a bit of extra dough, and although they were all wrong, they were right about one thing, and that's exactly what Mr. Mclean intended to do, to get back on the graft and start earning some real money. Lenny had made a few mates and started robbing shops for clothes and other items that they could sell back on the streets or markets at Hoxton or Roman.
Hey, bro, it's like, you know, and like, I understand the need to pretty much survive. But it's like, man, you're already a fighter, man. Like, why are you still stealing stuff and doing, you know, this type of criminal? Like, go find. You should already be trying to professionalize your fighting. You know what I mean? Like, you should already be trying to monetize your fighting. Like, instead of doing that criminal stuff, man.
When the gang had stolen
I don't
items,
understand. You know what I'm
they gave
saying?
them to a man called Tommy the Talker, who would get rid of everything for a good price. Some of the robberies would have the gang up until the early hours of the morning, and Lenny would be in bed when he eventually got home well into the afternoon. One afternoon, Lenny felt a bang on his head so hard he thought the ceiling had collapsed. When he opened his eye, he realised it was not the ceiling, but in fact Jim Irwin, who was shouting, saying, "It's 3 o'clock, this isn't no hotel." Now at this point, Mr. Mclean was a big lad, and already had a lot of fighting experience, beating up half the bouncers on the West End. So this was a big mistake, and Lenny got up and beat Mr. Irwin up. And Mr. Mclean says in his autobiography that if the room hadn't been bigger, his mum had not come running upstairs, he would have seriously hurt Mr. Irwin that day. His mum agreed that he had it coming, but pleaded with him not to hurt Mr. Irwin again. Lenny agreed on one condition, that Mr. Irwin never picked his hand on anyone in the house again. Around this time, Lenny started drinking in the Standard on Kingsland Road, and one night was having a drink with the governor's son, Sid, when in came a beautiful young woman with blonde hair. Lenny went over and introduced himself, and found out her name was Val. Lenny asked her for a drink, and the rest is history. The pair had dated for around 12 to 14 months, and when Lenny was 20 and Val was 18, they both decided to get married at Mayor Street Registry Office over Hackney Way, and after a party at Lenny's mum's place, they were happily married. The newlywed couple found a place to live in George's Square, round the back of Old Street, and had rented out 2 rooms. Val asked Lenny to find a proper job so that they could have some security in the future, and so Lenny took a job in a clothes factory in Curtin Grove, not far from his house. Mr. Mclean explains how the money he was paid was not the best, but he managed to find a few extra little earners at work to top his wages up. However, it wasn't long until these little earners got Mclean in a bit of trouble, and he ended up losing his job. Mr. Mclean reportedly described his family as his rock, and he's explained many times that his family existence helped him to reject a life that was solely devoted to crime, showing a slightly softer side from his usual cold demeanour. Lenny's wife Val has stated that he was so different from his image and was devoted to the kids and me. We were a little separate world that he kept away from all the violence and fighting.
I don't care how tough you are. I don't care what you do, but when it comes to those kids and your family, it's like you're just a whole other person. You know what I mean? And it's like all that aggression, all that negative feelings, all just everything that's bad just kind of goes away. You know what I mean? And you can just see a whole different type of person when it comes to a man's kids and family, man. And that's beautiful to me.
With his kids, Mr. Mclean's volatile nature became truly evident, as his mental illness showed in his actions towards his kids. Mr. Mclean would buy Kelly 30 chocolate Easter eggs, but fly into a rage if she chewed her dinner too loudly. He lacked control of his emotions and would often switch quickly, which she suggested had her and her family living in fear. In her own book, daughter Kelly, a mother of two, explained that she had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and says doctors told her that Mr. Mclean likely had a version of the disorder himself, which would explain the erratic behaviour and the anger presented heavily in Mr. Mclean's fighting and lifestyle. 2 years later, Mr. Mclean took a dark turn following his mother's death. Turning to drink, Mr. Mclean made it his mission to cause trouble in as many pubs as he could, violence being the only manner in which he could express himself. In his documentary, Jamie Mclean recounts a story, The Guvnor, where Lenny Mclean, heavily intoxicated...
The dude looks like the Hulk, bro. Like, he literally looks like the Hulk.
fought a man named Jimmy Briggs over a dispute with a girl. After breaking both of his hands on Mr. Briggs' face, Mr. Mclean used his teeth to bite through Mr. Briggs' windpipe, nearly killing him on the street. Mr. Briggs fortunately did survive following surgery, and Mr. Mclean
Bro, the dude bit the man on his neck, bro. My guy really tried to bite his neck off, dude.
very narrowly avoided prison. The sheer strength and rage Mr. Mclean possessed could not be more clearly displayed than through this story, truly showing how he earned the title the toughest man in Britain and the undisputed king of the Cobbles. Following this incident, Mr. Mclean decided to stop drinking, instead using his strength and skills for security work in the busy London nightclubs. Through this profession, it was inevitable that Mr. Mclean would have to mingle with some of London's most ruthless gangsters, acting as an enforcer in several circles. Following his retirement from fighting, these circles included those of celebrity and criminal underworld. It wasn't until Mr. Mclean was 26, however, that he was introduced to fighting. Mr. Mclean's first unlicensed boxing match came about as a result of a chance meeting that he had whilst in his late teens. When his car broke down in Blackwell Tunnel, he abandoned it and went to buy a replacement from a local criminal associate known as Kenny Mack, a gypsy used car salesman who worked in Kingsland Road, Hackney. Lenny brought a car and drove away, only to find out that the replacement would quickly fail too. A very angry Mr. Mclean returned to Mr. Mack later that day to demand his money back, but instead of refunding Mr. Mclean, Mr. Mack offered to give Mr. Mclean a brand new car in exchange for him fighting in one of Mr. Mack's unlicensed boxing bouts that was to be taking place later that night in Mack's yard. Mr. Mclean's immeasurable strength was too much for his opponent, who it was reported had lasted less than a minute against Lenny, earning Mr. Mclean £500 cash and a new car, a considerable prize at the time. Soon after this first fight, Mr. Mack and Mr. Mclean became friends, with Mr. Mack acting as Mr. Mclean's manager on several occasions in future fights. When Frank Warren formed the National Boxing Council in the 1970s, it allowed the toughest underground fighters in Britain an opportunity to compete legally. However, Lenny was Frank's cousin, and in recent years Mr. Warren has spoken extensively that in his eyes Mr. Mclean was a terrible bully, even though Lenny gave Mr. Warren his first chance to promote a fight, and most probably gave a young Mr. Warren a considerable amount of protection in a very violent and unpredictable world. Mr. Mclean faced a problem a lot of fighters face when they want more money for all the risk that they have taken, and this still happens to this day, but you can imagine the percentages of pay cuts were a lot worse back in the beginning. However, Frank was now calling the shots, and Mr. Mclean was burdened with an extensive criminal record. One that ensured that along with his cousin, who was the head of the Boxing Council board, that Mr. Mclean would never in any circumstance have an opportunity to become a licensed boxer. As such, Mr. Mclean was left with no choice but to enter the world of unlicensed boxing, and he quickly became one of its biggest stars and built up somewhat of a fearsome reputation in the industry. Throughout his fighting career, Mr. Mclean had upwards of 2,000 fights, with Lenny himself predicting some 4,000 fights under his belt over the 4 decades that Mr. Mclean had been active, both inside and outside.
Could you can you imagine how small his brain is now though, bro? Like fighting is not good for your brain. It's not good for your brain. It's not. That many fights has to have taken like a major toll on his brain.
Of the ring. On one occasion, Mr. Mclean was flown to New York on a special request to fight a Mafia Don's champion, a 24-stone, 6-foot, 8-inch unbeaten unit who was called John McCormick. However, Mr. Mclean's sheer strength rendered him unconscious in minutes, with Lenny hitting him so hard that he managed to break both his hands during the fight. Over all his fights, one opponent in particular stood out. That was his legendary nemesis, Mr. Roy Shaw. A firm hatred began between the two, and Mr. Shaw had an equally brutal...
Or where's this guy's eyeballs at, bro? Like that is scary, dude. You can't even see this guy's eyes. Like you can barely see this one eyeball right here, bro. How can you even see?
And ruthless reputation for violence to Mr. Mclean. Spending his adult life in prison, as well as in Broadmoor, having been declared too insane to function in a normal prison setting. Whilst Mr. Mclean had become an underworld enforcer and unlicensed boxing powerhouse, his name was feared up and down the country. Mr. Mclean's reputation for being a psychopath only furthered his career, referring to himself as the Governor, a name which ironically Lenny Mclean's stepfather had also used. A fact which was like a red rag to a bull to Mr. Mclean, using both these factors to build a reputation for himself into the undisputed king of the Cobbles. For Mr. Mclean, as soon as Mr. Shaw was released from prison, he would become an obvious foe, and for Mr. Shaw, if he wanted the title as the hardest man in Britain, well, he had to beat Mr. Mclean to claim the title. In their first meeting, Mr. Mclean was woefully unprepared for what came from an older and more skilled fighter, Roy the Mean Machine Shaw, and lost quickly to Mr. Shaw in his first fight, but was hasty to arrange a rematch, but this time things would be a lot different. Lenny had now realised that his anger and brute strength was not always going to be enough in a fight, and he would now have to actually train for a fight, something Lenny had never done. It now became clear to Mr. Mclean that if he trained, he could be an even better version of himself. In the rematch, Mr. Mclean was a completely different fighter and destroyed his opponent, this time having actually trained for his fight in a makeshift gym. Lenny, at one point, hit his opponent so hard that in the second round Mr. Mclean had knocked Mr. Shaw completely out of the ring, disqualifying Mr. Shaw almost immediately. In their third match, Mr. Shaw hardly stood a chance against the now well-trained and very well adapted to a new style of fighting Mr. Mclean, who did not hesitate to exhibit his newfound strength that he could come to be known for against his old...
Like, to have the natural ability to just be able to just really squabble, you know, without much competition, and then training, that's a whole different type of monster right there. That's something totally different. That's something scary.
Enemy Roy Shaw.
Especially when you look like this, like, bruh.
As a nearly unconscious Mr. Shaw was helped to his feet, Mr. Mclean could be heard shouting from the ring, "I'm the Governor," taking Mr. Shaw's nickname. The name is the one only given to the best fighter in the UK. Lenny was the Governor and never lost the title.
What's up guys, Robbie here. If you want to learn how to make $1,000 a day on
Having gained a reputation as a formidable force in the East End, Mr. Mclean used his newfound status to return to his previous work of security and enforcing for certain elite criminal organisations, and also minded for many well-known celebrities. Mr. Mclean had also held joint ownership of a public house in the East End of London, named the Governor's, along with Charlie Cray, the elder and less well-known brother of the Cray twins, who some say was the real brains behind the entire Cray's operation, showing Mr. Mclean's true extent of some of the serious connections that he had within the UK criminal underworld. Not only had Mr. Mclean throughout his years of experience as an unlicensed fighter gained many connections with the criminal underworld, but had now made himself very employable as a debt collector for the highest paying organised criminal families who needed someone of Mr. Mclean's size and stature to sort out a problem. According to Mr. Mclean's autobiography, his name was also quite useful for the smooth progress of various criminal dealings within the UK.
What's the character from Fantastic Four, bro? Was it the Thing or It? Rockman, Boulderhead? I don't know what his name is, bro, but that's right now. That's who I see, bro. The rock guy from Fantastic Four.
As everyone knew, if Lenny was involved, there was no messing about. It was also reported that he used to be used by members of the Provisional Irish Republican Army and the Mafia when they were doing business with criminals in the UK. Despite Mr. Mclean's evident notoriety, and extensive as it was, it failed to stop people from acting out at the pubs and bars, especially young lads who were unaware if or who Lenny was, and extremely intoxicated at the clubs that Mr. Mclean's security team had managed. On one occasion, whilst minding the door at the Barbican, Mr. Mclean was shot at close range in the arm and backside with a shotgun by a hitman on a motorcycle. In such a situation, he did not hesitate to chase the offender on foot before calling a cab and walking himself into the emergency room, very luckily surviving the following surgery. Not only was Mr. Mclean strong, but Mr. Mclean was very resilient, even with the worst types of pain, explaining just how he did so well both inside and outside of the ring. Following fighting, it was soon made evident just how many enemies that Mr. Mclean had acquired through fighting. A few years soon after the shotgun incident, Mr. Mclean was attacked in his own home when his wife answered the door to a masked gunman. The assailant took 4 shots at Mr. Mclean as he was coming down the stairs, though none of the bullets hit, and the shooter had disappeared by the time Mr. Mclean got to the door. Soon thereafter, Mr. Mclean was attacked at home again, this time as he had driven back from work. As he locked his car, Mr. Mclean was shot in the back of the shoulder as he made his way inside once again. Mr. Mclean again survived, but this time not even attempting a hospital visit. Mr. Mclean was now extremely upset and would later discover that one man was responsible for both attacks at his home. Upon receiving this information, and only now in a fit of rage, Mr. Mclean got his stuff and decided to track him down. The man Mr. Mclean was looking for was Billy Quinn, a boxer and drug addict who Mr. Mclean had apparently humiliated by giving him a beating, showing him just how dangerous his enemies from the fighting world could be. A potential life sentence if someone wanted to take it personal. However, no matter how hard Mr. Mclean looked, he could not find Billy Quinn, and so for now, Mr. Mclean tried to stay busy and focus on other things.
Yeah, two failed attempted murders, bro. You have to move out of the country. You have to move out of the country. Like, maybe after the first one, you probably would have been okay. You know what I mean? Like, as far as like people finding out who did it. When you do it 2 times, bro. Nah, it's time to go. It's time to pack up and go. Especially if you failed. It's time to pack it up. Rethink your assassin career. And
He had a
vanish.
fight coming up with the Mountain York and was training and getting ready for his fight when one day somebody came in and told Lenny that Mr. Quinn was in the other room and was sat there with a grin on his face, but that Mr. Mclean was unable to go into that room because there was a door blocking the room. Mr. Mclean ripped the door off and confronted Mr. Quinn, who had gone pale and dropped to his knees upon seeing Mr. Mclean fly inside the room in a fit of rage. He begged for mercy, explaining that he was on the gear and he had done that in an act of moment of madness and he would do anything for forgiveness. From there, all that I know is that Mr. Mclean shook his hand and accepted his apology. Within a few months, Mr. Quinn was found dead and his murder is still unsolved to this day. Lenny was arrested in connection with the crime but denied any involvement and was cleared of any wrongdoing. Around this time, many people had made an attempt on Mr. Mclean's life. It was beginning to become a regular occurrence. One of Lenny's friends had came to him and told him that there was a car driving around the manor with 4 guys who wanted to shoot Mr. Mclean. Mr. Mclean grabbed his friend and asked why he didn't tell them that he is not a hard man to find, as he drinks in the Green Man pub every day. On another occasion, Lenny was drinking in the Green Man when a friend who was running late, known as Johnny Price, asked to borrow Lenny's car so he could get to where he needed and back. He wouldn't be long, and he would chuck Lenny a drink for his troubles. Mr. Mclean agreed, but warned Mr. Price to hurry up as he didn't want to be sat around waiting to go home. Hours went by and Mr. Price had still not returned, and Mr. Mclean, who by this point had quite a few drinks, was starting to get very angry. As he was about to get up and inquire where Mr. Price had gone, another friend ran into the pub and explained that Mr. Price had gone to another pub called the Nile. However, upon arrival, another car pulled up and shot Mr. Price in the back of the legs. In his work, Mr. Mclean was known for taking the motto, "Treat kindness with kindness, but treat violence with violence," a motto Mr. Mclean displayed all too well in numerous fights that he got into with work. One of these fights landed Mr. Mclean in prison. In 1992, while working the Hippodrome in Leicester Square, London, Mr. Mclean removed a disruptive man by the name of Gary Humphreys, reportedly on drugs, for streaking and harassing women. Mr. Mclean admittedly broke the man's jaw in a scuffle. However, Mr. Humphreys died later that night from the severe neck injuries, and Mr. Mclean was arrested for the murder of Mr. Humphreys by the same policeman who had caught the Cray twins, Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reed. Mr. Mclean assumed the arrest had been made due to a personal vendetta from the officer on account of the close connection between the Crays and himself. Though the neck injuries were ultimately found to be the cause of death, and caused by the police that arrested the man after that night, Mr. Mclean was arrested for grievous bodily harm and sentenced to 18 months. Mr. Mclean was also a kind-hearted...
Oh my god, bro. Like, the police did it, bro. I mean, that's good, bro. Like, I really thought man was punching him so hard his neck was... Oh, I'm glad he didn't. I'm glad it wasn't from him, bro. But golly, bro. Let me look at these hands, bro. Like, I already said the dude looked like the Fantastic Four character, bro. I'm sure they feel as hard as rocks. I'm sure they do.
Man, often helping the people in his area when they were struggling. Jamie Mclean recounts a story speaking of a woman who had contacted him to tell him that Mr. Mclean had helped her out of her homelessness when she was sleeping outside Camden Palace, helping her to get a job and secure a room at her workplace so she was off the streets and able to save money up. The woman reportedly credits Mr. Mclean with saving her life by getting her off the streets. Despite his criminal lifestyle and background, Mr. Mclean's position as a supportive member of society cannot be understated, as he took care of those around him in his area. Also in this time, Mr. Mclean branched out both into acting and singing, appearing prominently in a television documentary on nightclub security staff titled Bounce Behind the Velvet Rope, and playing a brief unbilled cameo as a ringside spectator in the drama film The Craze 1990, based on his acquaintances, as well as releasing an Elvis cover in 1992. His largest and most famous role was in Guy Ritchie's Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels in 1998, playing the part of criminal enforcer Barry the Baptist. Mr. Mclean took a turn from violence. He instead turned to writing, working with author Peter Gerrard to write an autobiography called The Guvnor, published roughly 6 months before his death. It soon became a bestseller, selling over 3 million copies, prompting several sequels to be written after his passing by acquaintances. During the filming of Guy Ritchie's Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, Mr. Mclean was struck ill by what he believed to be the flu. Mr. Mclean was subsequently diagnosed with pleurisy, although further X-ray examination proved he was suffering from lung cancer. Mr. Mclean died shortly afterward on 28th of July 1998 in Bexley, a few weeks prior to the release of the film he is most well known for his appearance in. Mr. Mclean's son, Jamie, later said of his father, "My dad wasn't a born fighter. He was uneducated and a product of his upbringing, traumatized by what he had been through, and probably had mental health problems as a result of all of that." But
This guy looks like Jason Statham, bro. I needed to say that. He looks like Jason Statham. It's weird.
fighting was all he knew. Regardless of the personal opinion, the legacy and story left behind by Lenny Mclean will never be forgotten about in the UK criminal underworld. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read.
These are always very interesting. And some of the things that interest me the most is how similar some of these stories are. You know what I mean? Like as far as like the, you know, their upbringings and stuff. You know, I said this earlier in the video. There's always something similar, or there's always like a trend when it comes to these big time underground criminals. You know what I mean? Like as far as like how they're raised and what they had to do to survive. And the most interesting thing is how they decide to go about the rest of their life when they've, you know, when they've come to that age. You know, some of them, you know, choose a better path. Some of them, unfortunately, you know, die doing what they were doing. Some of them, you know, some of them just decide to just kind of fall off the map, bro, and just live life in peace. But it's definitely always interesting, man, to see the different stories. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you guys give the video a thumbs up, post in the comments down below, and of course, man, smash that big red button. And of course, I want to thank every single one of you guys for hitting that red button and getting this channel to 1,000 subscribers. Let's go, baby. You feel me? All right, y'all. Until next time, man, put your muscles up. The boy's out of here. Peace.